For 26 years, the man who murdered Christy Mirack didn't hide. He didn't flee the state. He didn't change his name or disappear into a new life. He did the opposite. He became famous. In the same county where he had killed a 25-year-old schoolteacher 4 days before Christmas, he built a career as one of the most popular disc jockeys around, spinning records at weddings, at clubs, at community events, even at elementary schools. Thousands of people danced to his music. They hired him for the happiest days of their lives. They knew his stage name, and not one of them knew what he had done. In December of 1992, Christy Mirack was a 6th-grade teacher in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. On the last morning of her life, she had her coat and gloves on, Christmas presents ready for her students, about to walk out the door for the last day of school before the holiday. She never made it out of her living room. An intruder forced his way in, and in the space of a single morning, took everything. For 26 years, police had his DNA and no name to attach it to. They had a genetic profile of the killer and nobody to match it against. They interviewed, they investigated, they released a sketch, they chased every lead, and every lead went nowhere. The man was hiding in the most audacious way possible, in plain sight, on stage, under the lights, with a microphone in his hand. And then a relative he barely knew did something completely ordinary. She spit into a tube and mailed her DNA to a genealogy website, hoping to learn about her family history. Before we get into it, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe. This is exactly what we do here. That single act, a distant relative's curiosity about her ancestry, would do what 26 years of police work could not. It would build a bridge, one branch of a family tree at a time, straight to a locally beloved entertainer named Raymond Rowe, better known to the people of Lancaster County as DJ Freez. This is the story of the case that made history, the first murder ever solved and convicted using genetic genealogy, and how the man who did it was caught by a piece of chewing gum he spit out while DJing at an elementary school. Christy Mirack was 25 years old, and she had built exactly the life she wanted. She was a 6th-grade teacher at an elementary school in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, the kind of teacher who prepared Christmas presents for her students, who was remembered by the people around her with a warmth that didn't fade even decades later. Teaching wasn't just a job for her. It was who she was. She had the whole arc of a young life just getting started, a career she loved, a community around her, people who counted on her and looked forward to seeing her every morning. Lancaster County in 1992 was the kind of place where that life made sense. Rolling farmland, small towns, tight communities, the sort of area where people knew their neighbors and didn't lock their doors during the day. It felt safe. It felt like the kind of place where nothing truly terrible happened. The kind of place, in other words, where people let their guard down, because for the most part, they had every reason to. Christy lived in a townhome in East Lampeter Township, which she shared with a roommate. On the morning of December 21st, 1992, 4 days before Christmas, the last day of school before the holiday break, she was doing what any devoted teacher does on that particular day of the year. She had presents ready for her students and her co-workers. She had her coat on. She had her gloves on. She was, by every indication, moments from walking out the door and driving to the school she loved to spend one last joyful day with her 6th graders before Christmas. That is the image to hold on to. A 25-year-old teacher, coat and gloves on, arms full of presents, 4 days before Christmas. Because that is who Christy Mirack was in the final moments before everything was taken from her. Not a case file, not a cold case statistic. A young woman on the best day of the school year, about to give gifts to children who adored her. She never made it out of her living room. The timeline of that morning is narrow, and it matters, because it tells you something about the person who did this. Christy's roommate left their townhome for work at around 7 o'clock that morning. Christy herself typically left about 45 minutes later, around 7:45. That left a window, a gap of roughly 45 minutes, in which Christy was alone in the home, getting ready for her day. That was the window the killer used, which tells investigators something chilling. This was not random. Someone knew, or had watched closely enough to learn, that there was a narrow slice of time each morning when Christy Mirack was home alone. Someone timed it. During that window, an intruder forced his way into the townhome. What followed was violent and fast. Christy was beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled. Near her body, investigators would find a wooden cutting board that had been used as a weapon in the attack. The brutality of it, combined with the makeshift weapon, suggested someone acting with rage, disorganized in the moment, but deliberate in having chosen that moment at all. When Christy didn't arrive at school that morning and couldn't be reached, concern grew quickly. This was not someone who simply failed to show up. A school colleague went to check on her, and in Christy's own living room, in the townhome she'd been about to leave with her arms full of Christmas presents, they found her. 25 years old, coat and gloves still on, 4 days before Christmas. The community was shattered. A young, beloved schoolteacher, murdered in her own home in broad daylight, in a township where this kind of thing simply did not happen. The pressure on investigators was immediate and intense, and they did have one thing, the most important thing, even if they didn't yet know how long it would take to use it. The killer had left his DNA behind at the scene, on Christy's body and on the carpet beneath her. They had his genetic signature, they just had no one to match it to. In the months and years after Christy Mirack's murder, Lancaster County investigators did everything the era allowed. They interviewed witnesses. They talked to Christy's friends, her family, her colleagues. They looked into her past and her relationships. They chased down every lead that came in. At one point, a witness had seen a white vehicle near the apartment complex that morning, and investigators worked that detail. They developed a sketch, released it publicly, and it generated leads. Plenty of leads. None of them led to the killer. The problem was fundamental. The most powerful piece of evidence they had was the DNA. And in the 1990s, DNA could only help you if you already had a suspect to compare it to, or if the killer's profile was sitting in a criminal database. Christy's killer wasn't in any database. He had never been arrested for anything that would have collected his DNA, so his genetic profile, a perfect, unique identifier of the man who did this, sat in an evidence file, matching no one. Year after year, the case stayed open and cold. Investigators would come back to it, run the DNA against newly available databases, and get nothing. The technology of criminal DNA matching kept improving, but it was all built on the same limitation. It could only find people already in the system. And the man they were looking for had spent the years since 1992 making very sure he stayed a respectable, upstanding, entirely unarrested member of the community. For Christy's family, the decades were their own kind of torment. Her brothers, her father, the people who had loved her, they lived with the double weight of losing her and not knowing who had done it. A brother would later say that the murder, 4 days before Christmas, had destroyed his family's sense of security, and even their love of the holiday itself. Christmas, for them, became inseparable from the worst thing that had ever happened. 26 years is a long time to carry that, and for most of it, there was no reason to believe an answer would ever come. The case had gone as cold as a case can go. What the family didn't know, what nobody knew, was that the answer was already out there, performing under bright lights at events all over Lancaster County, hiding in the most public way imaginable. To understand how audacious this was, you have to understand who Raymond Rowe had become. Rowe was a local success story. In the 1980s, he'd been a breakdancer. He won local DJ battles, built a name for himself, and hosted dance parties at Lancaster's Chameleon Club. Over the years, he grew that into a genuine business, performing under the name DJ Freez. For a time, he ran a retail store selling music, clothes, and DJ equipment, but it was the DJing that made him locally famous. He worked weddings, the happiest, most trusting day of people's lives. He worked clubs, he worked community events, he even worked school functions, DJing for children. He was, by all appearances, a pillar of the local entertainment scene, someone you'd hire without a second thought, someone whose name, in Lancaster County, meant a good time. In the 25 years he spent building that business and that reputation, he never raised a whisper of suspicion. Not one. And here is the detail that makes the whole thing colder. When investigators finally pieced the case together, prosecutors revealed something that had been sitting in the evidence the entire time. One of Rowe's DJ business cards was found in Christy Mirack's wallet. Think about what that means. Whatever the exact connection between them, and investigators were always careful to say some questions about how they knew each other might never be answered. Christy had one of DJ Freez's cards in her wallet at the time she was murdered. He wasn't a total stranger who picked a random house. There was some thread between the victim and the entertainer, however faint. Investigators also determined that Rowe had lived about 4 miles from Christy in 1992, and that her home sat along a likely route between his house and where he worked. His vehicle at the time, a white Toyota, matched the white vehicle a witness had reported seeing near the apartment that morning. Every piece was there in 1992. The DNA, the proximity, the vehicle, the business card in her wallet. Everything except the one thing that could tie it all to a name. And that one thing wouldn't exist for another 26 years. The break in the Christy Mirack case did not come from Lancaster. It came from a woman who had never met Raymond Rowe, doing something millions of people do every year. She was Rowe's half-sister, and at some point she did what so many of us have done. She bought a consumer DNA kit, spit into a tube, and uploaded her genetic information to a public genealogy database. Curious about her family history and her ancestry, she wasn't thinking about a murder. She almost certainly didn't know Raymond Rowe well at all. By some accounts, Rowe didn't even really know her. She was just a person, curious about where she came from. But her DNA carried something she couldn't have known it carried: half the genetic markers of a killer's close relative. By 2018, investigators working Christy's case had learned about a brand new technique, the same one that had just been used to identify the Golden State Killer in California. It was called forensic genetic genealogy, and it worked in a way no previous method had. Instead of running the crime scene DNA against criminal databases, which only contain people who've been arrested, you run it against public ancestry databases, which contain ordinary people who volunteered their DNA. You're not looking for the killer, you're looking for the killer's family. Lancaster investigators partnered with Parabon Nanolabs and their lead genetic genealogist, C.C. Moore. Parabon took the DNA profile from Christy's crime scene and uploaded it to a public genealogy database, and it returned matches, relatives of the unknown killer. Among the genetic connections that came back was a strong one, a half-sister. From there, Moore did the painstaking work of building a family tree, connecting the branches, narrowing the possibilities. The genetic data told her things about the suspect. He had roughly half Northern European ancestry, and he was half Puerto Rican. That detail, the Puerto Rican heritage, actually slowed her down at first, because the suspect wasn't carrying his father's surname, he was using his mother's. But then she found something online, an interview with a local minor celebrity, a DJ, who mentioned in passing that he liked to cook Puerto Rican food because he was half Puerto Rican. That was it. That was the final piece. The family tree, the ancestry, the surname, and a throwaway line in a local celebrity interview all converged on one man, Raymond Rowe, DJ Freez. Genetic genealogy gave investigators a name, but a family tree match is a lead, not proof. To arrest Raymond Rowe, they needed to prove that his DNA, his specifically, not a relative's, matched the DNA left at Christy Mirack's murder scene 26 years earlier. They couldn't just walk up and demand a sample. That could tip him off, and at this stage, they were building a case that had to hold up in court. So they did what investigators do in these situations. They watched him. They waited for him to leave a piece of himself behind in public. And here is where the story lands its cruelest irony. On May 31st, 2018, undercover investigators followed Raymond Rowe to a gig. He was working as the DJ at an event at Smoketown Elementary School, performing for children in a school, the same kind of trusting community setting he'd operated in for decades. While he worked, he chewed gum and drank from a water bottle, and when he was done with them, he discarded them. Investigators collected that discarded chewing gum and that used water bottle. They sent them to a Pennsylvania State Police crime lab, and the lab compared the DNA from those items Raymond Rowe's DNA, against the DNA recovered from Christy Mirack's body and from the carpet beneath where she had died. It was a match, a conclusive, unambiguous match. The DJ who had spent 26 years entertaining Lancaster County, who was, at that very moment, DJing at an elementary school, had just been identified as the man who raped and murdered a 25-year-old teacher 4 days before Christmas in 1992. On June 25, 2018, investigators arrested Raymond Rowe at his home. The prosecutor, District Attorney Craig Stedman, announced the arrest but was deliberately restrained about it. "This is just the beginning," he said. "By no means a closed investigation." He knew the weight of what they were doing, and he wasn't going to take a victory lap. The man on stage was finally off it. Raymond Rowe's arrest was historic, and not only for Lancaster County. Genetic genealogy had made headlines earlier in 2018 with the arrest of the Golden State Killer, but that case was still working its way through the courts. The Christy Mirack case moved faster to resolution, and in doing so, it became the first murder case in which genetic genealogy led to a conviction. Not just an arrest, a conviction. The technique had proven it could do more than generate a lead. It could close a case all the way to the end. But before it got there, the case raised exactly the kind of legal questions you'd expect from a brand new technique. Rowe's defense could have challenged how the DNA was obtained, whether collecting a relative's genetic data from a public database, then surreptitiously grabbing Rowe's discarded gum and water bottle, amounted to an unlawful search. Legal scholars debated it publicly. One professor pointed out the genuinely hard question at the center of it. If your sibling uploads their DNA, those are their cells, but the information revealed is, in a sense, also yours. Courts across the country would eventually have to grapple with these questions. But in Christy Mirack's case, the evidence was overwhelming. When District Attorney Stedman laid out the DNA statistics in court, the numbers were staggering. The odds that anyone other than Rowe had left that DNA ran into figures with 27 and 30 zeros. As Stedman put it bluntly, in other words, it was the defendant. There are only about 7.5 billion people in the world. The math left no room for anyone else. Faced with that, Rowe made a decision. According to his own defense attorney, at their very first meeting, Raymond Rowe confessed. He told his lawyers he did it. He told them he wanted to plead guilty. On January 8, 2019, Raymond Rowe stood in a Lancaster County courtroom and pleaded guilty to the first-degree murder and rape of Christy Mirack, along with related charges. Prosecutors had been prepared to seek the death penalty. The plea was reached after discussions that included Christy's family, and in exchange, Rowe received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, followed by a consecutive term of 60 to 120 years. He would die in prison. The only real question the plea left open was the one prosecutors said might never be answered. Why? Stedman declined to offer a motive, citing the 26 years that had passed. Some questions, he said, might never be answered publicly. In the courtroom, Rowe turned to face Christy's family, and he apologized. "I'm sorry, sir," to the family, he said, addressing Christy's father, who was so overwhelmed that he kept his head bowed and could not look up. "I can't imagine what you're going through." But it was Christy's brother, Vince Mirack, who spoke the words that cut through the room. He told Rowe that if not for the grace of modern technology and what he called divine intervention, Rowe would have simply stayed in Lancaster and continued to bask in his fame. He talked about how the murder, 4 days before Christmas, had destroyed his family's sense of security and their love of the holiday. And then he told Raymond Rowe, "I can only hope that the remainder of your life is as painful to you as the last 26 years have been to my family." 26 years. That was the length of the sentence Christy's family had already served. A sentence handed to them by a man who, for every one of those years, had been out in the world, celebrated, applauded, hired for weddings and parties, living the life he had stolen from Christy the chance to live. For the Mirack family, the guilty plea should have been the end, but Raymond Rowe was not quite finished. Less than a year after admitting his guilt in open court, after his own lawyers had stated plainly that he'd confessed to them, after he'd apologized to Christy's father's bowed head, Rowe began trying to undo it. He started filing appeals, and in 2021, he took the stand and told an entirely new story. That he and Christy Mirack had actually had a secret relationship, that they'd had consensual sex on the day she died, and that she was still alive when he left. Someone else, he now claimed, must have killed her. It's worth pausing on how much this version asks you to believe. It asks you to accept that the man who confessed to his own attorneys, who pleaded guilty in court, who apologized to the victim's family, had been lying then and was telling the truth now, years later, from prison, with a life sentence to escape. It asks you to believe that in the narrow 45-minute window when Christy was home alone, after Rowe supposedly left, a completely different killer entered and murdered her, leaving behind no DNA of his own, only Rowe's. Rowe sought DNA testing on items from the scene: Christy's sweater, used to strangle her, and the wooden cutting board used to beat her, insisting the real killer's DNA would be found on them. But as the judge who reviewed it noted, those items could have been tested before Rowe pleaded guilty, and weren't, reportedly because his own trial team didn't want to test items that might further confirm his guilt. A Lancaster County judge, Dennis Reinecker, rejected Rowe's petition, writing that he was unable to fathom that someone else had entered the home in that window. The court found Rowe's new version simply not believable. The legal maneuvering has continued through the appeals courts in the years since, but the core facts have never moved. Rowe's DNA, on Christy's body, and on the carpet beneath her, with odds against anyone else in the tens of zeros, a confession to his own lawyers, a guilty plea, an apology in open court. Whatever stories came later, that foundation has held. The Christy Mirack case changed things, for her family and for the entire field of cold case investigation. For the family, it brought an answer after 26 years, though it could never bring peace in any complete sense. Christy was still gone, the holidays were still marked, and the man responsible had spent a quarter-century thriving while they grieved. But they got the truth. They got to look at him in a courtroom and say what they had waited 26 years to say. And they got the certainty that he would never again stand under bright lights, never again be hired for someone's wedding, never again be anywhere but a prison cell. For everyone else, the case became a landmark. It was the first murder conviction obtained through genetic genealogy, the proof of concept that this technique could carry a case from an untraceable DNA sample all the way to a life sentence. After Christy's case, the floodgates opened. Across the country, cold case units began pulling their oldest, most hopeless files and sending decades-old DNA to genealogists. Case after case that had been frozen for 30, 40, 50 years suddenly had a path forward. Every one of those solved cases stands, in part, on the ground that Christy Mirack's case broke first. There's a lesson buried in how it happened, too. Raymond Rowe did everything right, from a criminal's perspective. He was never arrested. He kept his DNA out of every criminal database. He built a spotless public reputation. By the old rules, he was untouchable. The perfect uncaught killer. What he couldn't control, what nobody can control, was the DNA of the family he was born into. A half-sister he barely knew, curious about her ancestry, undid 26 years of careful invisibility with a single swab. You cannot opt out of your own bloodline. That is the quiet revolution at the center of this case. If there's a lesson in Christy Mirack's story, it's that hiding in plain sight only works until the science changes. For 26 years, Raymond Rowe was the last person anyone would suspect. A beloved local DJ, a fixture at the happiest events in people's lives, a man with a spotless record and a good reputation, performing for the very community whose trust he'd betrayed. He wasn't hiding in a bunker or on the run. He was on stage, in the lights, with a microphone, because he understood that the safest place to hide a monstrous secret is behind a friendly, famous face. And for a quarter of a century, he was right. What he didn't count on, what he couldn't have counted on in 1992, was that a technology would one day exist that didn't need to catch him at all. It only needed to catch a relative. It only needed one distant family member, curious about her roots, to hand over a little saliva. From there, the branches of a family tree did what no detective in 26 years had managed to do. They walked straight up onto the stage and pointed at DJ Freez. He was caught by a piece of gum he spit out while entertaining children. There is a kind of justice in that detail that no screenwriter could improve. Christy Mirack was 25 years old. She was a teacher who loved her students, and on the last morning of her life she had her coat and gloves on and her arms full of Christmas presents, 4 days before the holiday. She deserved to walk out that door. It took 26 years, a stranger's curiosity, and a piece of discarded gum. But the man who took that from her finally answered for it, and he will answer for it for the rest of his life. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe these cases deserve to be told, subscribe. The next one is coming.